in the short amount of time that I've been up here, you've probably noticed some things about me. You might have noticed my height, or the shape of my face, or the sound of my voice. And you might have taken all of this information and plunked it into your little brain calculator, and you might have come to the conclusion that I'm a woman. You would be wrong, but don't worry, it's not your fault. We are taught from birth that there are only two genders. A person gets pregnant, and the questions begin. Is it a boy, or is it a girl? Sometimes, oh, right, I need the clicker. You gave me that for a reason. Sometimes they do gender reveals, right? They cut open a cake, or they rip open an envelope, or if your hometown is anything like mine, they shoot boxes of explosives from the back of their truck. But even if you don't do a gender reveal, eventually that baby comes out and the doctor holds it up and says, "Congratulations, it's a boy," or "Congratulations, it's a girl." And that one phrase dictates what that tiny human being is for the rest of their life. We find out what that person is long before we find out who that person is. See, we live in a society that is obsessed with the gender binary. And when I say the gender binary, I'm talking about the idea that there are two genders, binary, 1, 2, or 1 and 0 if you're, computery. Just men and just women. Men, women, full stop, those are your only two options. We see this message absolutely everywhere in our society. In Western culture, we see it in books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. We see it in the rom-coms that raised me in the early 2000s. We see it in the idea that men and women are somehow fundamentally different. We even see it in the way that we gender our bathrooms. So what does it mean to be non-binary in this society? It means that my gender is something outside of that gender binary, outside of those two options. I'm not a man and I'm not a woman. And there are all sorts of non-binary genders, and they all use various different terms, and all of those terms are valid, but I just like the term non-binary. Its very name is a disruption. I get to be a disruption just by existing. Lucky me. And so, in this gendered society, being non-binary sometimes means that, you go against the binary, you go against the flow, and sometimes people think that means that you go against what's normal or what's right. Because, like a lot of things that are everywhere in our society, we think that things are common, or we think that things are normal just because they're common. And so because it's common to fall into a binary gender, we think that that means that it's normal. Because it's uncommon to fall into a non-binary gender, we think that that means it's abnormal in some way. But a whole ton of things are normal that are not super common. Blue eyes are normal but uncommon. Red hair is normal but uncommon. Being left-handed is normal but uncommon. Statistically speaking, being in what is currently known as Canada is super, globally speaking, super uncommon, right? Just statistically, you're not going to be Canadian. But you don't see people going like, "Oh, you're like Canadian? I'm sorry, are you sure you're not just like an American in a toque?" My apologies, but I just really disagree with that whole Canadian lifestyle. And if you think I'm exaggerating about what people say about non-binary people, unfortunately, I'm not. See, that's the thing about disrupting people's world just by existing. People super do not like it when their world is disrupted. So instead of saying, "Hey, Lee, you know what? I've thought about it, and I've realized that maybe gender is socially constructed. Maybe I've just been taught from birth that there are binary genders. Maybe I should question that in myself." Instead of doing any of that, they get out the greatest weapon known to mankind. Humankind, I should say. The grade 12 biology textbook. So they get out this grade 12 biology textbook, and they say, hey, Lee, have you ever thought about how there are only men and there are women, there are just men and women, those are your only two options, because the only genitalia that exist are penises and vaginas? Have you thought about that? As a side note, I Googled, can I say the word penis in a TED Talk? As it turns out, I can. But I do sincerely want to address this idea that, in grade 12 bio, I learned that there are X chromosomes and Y chromosomes, and depending on your mix, you either get an innie or an outie, and those are your only two options. An innie or an outie, yeah. Because, as it turns out, even biological sex is not binary. There are all sorts of chromosome combinations. There are all sorts of ambiguous and unambiguous genitalia. There are all sorts of Hormone varieties. There are people who are born intersex, which is when their genitalia does not clearly fit the binary, the penis-vagina binary that I just mentioned. And there are intersex people who are going to be way better at speaking at this than I am, but I just think it's really important that we know that that whole binary idea, whether it's gender or whether it's sex, doesn't always work. It just doesn't reflect reality. Life is always way more complicated than just two options. Also, unless you've had genetic testing, you probably don't know what your chromosome levels are, or your chromosomes are, or your hormone levels. Also, I don't know how to say this other than it is super, super weird to categorize people by their genitalia. Like, I know we've just kind of decided as a society that that's a thing that we do, but it's super, super weird. I'm not a woman because I have a vagina any more than I'm a woman because I have elbows or eyebrows or feet. But that's what we do in our binary gendered society. We look at a sonogram, and we look at what's between its legs, and we go, ah, yes. This will dictate whether this human being likes blue or pink. This will dictate whether this human being likes trucks or tutus. This will dictate whether this human being is going to make $1 or 78 cents. I'm so glad you liked that joke. And so this is probably the part of the presentation where you're going like, Lee, I get it. Gender is socially constructed. Okay, you've like harped on that point. Like, I get it. But the problem or the solution is just to eliminate gender roles. Let boys play with dolls and let girls play with trucks and let's just see people as people. And like maybe, big picture, maybe that's eventually where we kind of want to be. But that's also ignoring this gigantic socio-political context of gender. Like, is gender socially constructed? Absolutely. Money is also socially constructed, but that does not mean that it is not real, because apparently I still need to pay my rent. There are all sorts of aspects to being non-binary that I could talk about. I could talk about how there are all sorts of non-binary genders and how they all might use different terms and how all of those are valid. I could talk about how non-binary genders have existed throughout tons of cultures and throughout the past and in the present, and we will continue to exist in the future. I could talk about how the gender binary was actually a tool of colonialism. It was used to force colonized populations into rigid European gender roles. I could talk about how important gender-neutral washrooms are, and I could talk about how frustrating it is that our entire identities get reduced to where we pee. I could talk about all the things that gender is not. I could talk about how we are not our bodies. We are not our clothing. We are not our hair or our makeup or what society expects of us. I could talk about all of these things. But we don't have all day. You've all been very patient with me so far, so I'm going to talk about exactly one word. And that word is they. So talking about the word they, I'm talking about they as a pronoun. Specifically, they as a singular gender-neutral pronoun. So not they as in, wow, that crowd at TEDxUNB, all of those individuals, they look so good. Not like that. We're talking about, wow, that individual on stage at TEDxUNB, they sure look good. Thank you, I appreciate that. We use the singular they all the time. It's already very much a part of how we speak. We say, you know, someone told me a joke the other day. What is their Twitter handle? All jokes happen on Twitter for me, apparently. Someone left you a package the other day. Where did they leave it? We use the singular they all the time, even when we are arguing against using the singular they. I don't recognize another person's right to determine what pronouns I use to address them. This is super awkward. But the singular gender-neutral they is already very much a part of our lexicon. It's already very much a part of what we say. And so when you don't use the singular they for someone who has asked you to use the singular they, it's like dehumanizing, absolutely. It's kind of saying like, I know your life better than you know your life. But it's also just rude, really. It's like if you met a new person and you were like, hi, nice to meet you. And they said, hi, my name is Steven. And you said, hey, Stevie, what's up? And they were like, oh, like, no worries, but I actually prefer Steven. And you go, okay, well, like, Steven is just a lot for me to like get my mouth around, and it's just really inconvenient for me, and it makes me kind of uncomfortable. So I'm just gonna go ahead and call you Stevie. You're cool with that, right? Another argument that I hear about the singular they is that it's grammatically incorrect. I have an English degree from the University of New Brunswick, woo! And so I'm actually super willing to argue with you about this. I'm desperate to put my English degree to good use. couple of grammatical arguments. One is that we have been using the singular they for a lot longer than we kind of arbitrarily decided that we should stop using it. The other thing is that language shifts and changes and grows. Language is designed to be descriptive, not prescriptive. That means things exist in the world and we find language to describe them, not we are limiting what exists in the world based on what language we have. The other thing is that whether or not something is grammatically correct is never going to be as important as whether a phrase recognizes the dignity of another human being. Like, I'm sorry, it's just never going to be as important. Oh, I'm sure there was another point I was going to make, and now I forget what it is. So we're here to talk about disruption. So I want to talk about disrupting the language that we use. Oh, I remembered what I was going to say. So a little story about grammar. I know you were all super excited about grammar. So a little story about grammar. I one time went to lunch with this professor, an older woman who spent a good amount of time talking about how when she was younger, she used Ms. instead of Miss or Mrs. back before it was kind of a popular thing to do. And she said, you know what? It's no one's business whether or not I'm married. And in my mind, I thought, yes, language is political. The way that we describe ourselves makes a political difference. Absolutely. And I thought it really made sense about how these binaries continue to do a disservice to so many people. And then she spent the next half of the lunch talking about how she doesn't accept singular they on any of the assignments that her students pass in. So you might say that she missed the point. Yeah, Twitter loved that joke. So we're here to talk about disruption. So I want to talk about disrupting the language that we use. I want to talk about using language as a tool to disrupt oppressive systems in our society. Because using different language might seem like a really simple thing, but language is political, language is important, and language is powerful. If it wasn't political, important, and powerful, people would not get so mad when you ask them to use different words. So language is one tool that we have at our disposal to start disrupting these systems. So when you use the singular they, when you use they pronouns for someone who asks you to use they pronouns for them, you're recognizing that person's humanity. You are not giving us humanity for what it's worth. We already have that humanity. We get it by being born human. But you're recognizing another person's humanity. And when you recognize another person's humanity, and I mean recognizing everyone else's humanity, regardless of how much you know about the whole gender thing, as it's often called, regardless of whether or not you can name LGBTQ, regardless of how you feel about those things, when you recognize another person's humanity, their innate humanity, that's going to be a big disruption, and that disruption just might make the world a better place. At the very least, it's worth a shot. That's my presentation. Thank you all so much.